everybody, it's Courtney, and I am back with another project using the latest Simon Says stamp card kit. I'm going to be playing around with some Polychromos today, and I have a piece of Audrey Blue cardstock, and this is just from my stash. This is cut down to 4 by 5 1/4. I'm going to be stamping out my little Santa, and I'll mask out just the end of his little list there. And I'm going to be stamping this little sign, and I wanted this to appear like it was behind this little list or behind Santa. So I'm stamping with blackout ink by Ink on 3, and we'll move right into the coloring because this is going to be super simple. So I'm going at this a little bit different than I have before, just to kind of try things out, especially I'm working on colored cardstock, so I need to make sure that I have a lot of pigment down. So like I always do, I'm going in with my lightest color with a very light hand and covering up the entire area. And then I'll go in with my darkest color, and then for his face, it's Indian red. And I'm going in with a very heavy hand and adding that shadow. And then I'll go in with a heavy hand again and add my mid-tone color, which is cinnamon. And then back to my lightest color, again with a very heavy hand, and this is the light flesh color. Going to do the same thing for his little hat here, and I'm going to start off with what was originally going to be my lightest color, and again going in with a very light hand. You're not going to get all that much coverage here, but the more pigment that you put down, the smoother coverage that you'll get. So I'm going to be adding in my shadows here, which is just on the base of his hat and off to the left, and this is middle cadmium red. And again, going in with a pretty heavy hand, blending that out with deep scarlet red, then blending that out even further with pale geranium lake, and then back to what was going to be my lightest color, which is the rose carmine, but I wasn't getting enough contrast, so I ended up bringing in more of a pink color. It's pink madder lake, and I'm going over the entire thing to get a nice smooth coverage on this. And that way I still have that highlight color as well. Now, typically they say, and what I've always been told, is to always go in with a light hand and just keep layering and layering and layering. And I think that's why I don't use my pencils as much as I'd like to, because I do not have the patience for that. So this is why I'm trying to see if I go in right away with that heavy hand, starting with my shadows, if I was able to blend it. And I had absolutely no problem at all. And it probably depends on the type of pencils that you're using. I know that Prismacolors are very high quality. I didn't personally get the results from Prismacolors that I do get with the Polychromos. But for his little outfit here, I'm putting my shadows underneath his arm and where his beard is hanging over his arm as well, and off to the left-hand side, using the same color combination as I did for his hat, including that lightest color that I ended up adding in later for that highlight. Next, we'll move on to his beard. And I wanted there to be a little bit of texture, I guess, to this. So I am, again, going in with my lightest color. This is the cold gray number 1. And you can probably barely see it, but I am just covering up the entire area with a very light hand. Then I'm going to be doing some flicks just to get some texture. So this is the cold gray number 4, and I'm just adding flicks down from the top of his beard down, and I'm not going very far, and I'm going with a pretty light hand in this case. I didn't want to press too hard and press my luck. Next, I'll extend those flicks out a little bit further with the cold gray number 3. And then do the same thing with the cold gray number 2, again with a very light hand. And then I'll go back to that cold gray number 1, and I'm just going to be covering up the entire thing this time with a pretty heavy hand so that I get a very nice smooth texture. Some of the flick lines will blend out, but in the end you'll still be able to see them a bit. If you go in with a lighter hand, you'll be able to add more color later. Once you kind of get that smooth finish, you're not really going to be able to add much color, if any, at all at that point. So for his little mouth there, I just went in solid with that lightest color that we used for the red combination and just colored that in solid. I didn't do any shading for that. For his belt and his little boots, I'm going to go in right with the darkest color because these areas are so teeny tiny. I felt like I was probably going to get a pretty good blend anyway. So I'm just adding some shading with the black on the left-hand side of his boots and his belt. Blend that out with the cold gray number, what is this? Number 5, I think it was. And then the number 4, just to add a little bit of a highlight. Next, we'll move on to the white parts of his hat and the little cuffs on his sleeves. And I want these to actually be white, but I will be doing just a little bit of shading. So I'm bringing in my white pencil here, again, going in with a very light hand, filling in those areas. Then just for a little bit of shading, I'm bringing in my cold gray number 2 and just putting a little bit of shading on either side of his hat, on the left side of that little pom-pom there, and on the bottom of his the cuff of his sleeve. Blend that out a little bit further with the cold gray number 1, and then finally going back in with that white pencil. And again, heavy hand on all of this and still not having any problem blending. I thought maybe I was just getting lucky with the skin tones and reds, but throughout the entire card, I just didn't have a problem. So for the list that he's holding, I want this to be white too, but there's a lot of folds and everything in this. So I'm going to be adding a little bit more shading than I did for his hat and little cuffs on his sleeves. So again, starting off very light hand with the white pencil. And I'm going to start off with my cold gray number 3. So I'm going in a little bit darker than I did for his hat. And I'm putting some shading anywhere it's folded or curved. So on the top here, there would be a shadow there, and where it's kind of flowing. The entire way is kind of flowing. So anytime there is one part of it that's kind of hanging over another part of it, if that makes any sense, I'm adding some shading. And again, going in with a pretty heavy hand here. Next, I'll blend those areas out with the cold gray number 2, going directly over the cold gray number 3 and just extending it out a little bit further. Some of these areas aren't going to have, especially this top part that I'm on now, there's not going to be all that much of a highlight, but being it's kind of bowed out a little bit, you want to make sure that you do preserve some sort of a highlight to make that appear like it is bowed out. So once I had my cold gray number 2, I will go in with my cold gray number 1, which is almost white in itself. But again, going over that same area that we already colored and just extending it out a little bit further. And then finally going in with my white pencil again and covering up the entire area. Now, being I'm coloring on colored cardstock, which honestly I've never done before, you may have to go over certain areas more than once. Even though you're pressing down pretty hard, you still might see a little bit of that blue or whatever color cardstock you're coloring on kind of peeking through in some areas. So you may have to go over it more than once. Also, the white is more opaque. So some of the lines within the image where I stamped, I'm kind of losing those lines a little bit. So once my coloring was done, I will go in and fix some of those areas up just to make sure that I do have a bold black outline for all of my images. Next, we'll move on to the pole of the sign here. And I'm just going to show you the reds. I did every other stripe here, red and white. So I'm going to go in with the lightest color, and I'm using the same color combination that I used for the hat and his little outfit there, but I skipped the lightest mid-tone just because these are such a tiny area. So putting my shading on either side, I'm having to move over again because if you've ever watched my videos, you know that Frankie here has just become a part of them. So I'm going to add just a line of color on either side of these stripes. Because the pole is a round object, you want to make sure that you preserve a highlight in the center. So once those lines were down, I'm just going to make those lines a little bit thicker with my darkest midtone. And I'm not really worried about shading as far as where the sign is hanging over it. I'm just pretty much making sure that I preserve that highlight right there in the center. Going in with my lightest midtone and thickening that area up a little bit further, just leaving just a little bit of a highlight there in the center for my lightest color, which I'll just go in and cover up the entire area, including that little ball that's on the top. I just did some shading on the top left and the bottom right, just to kind of preserve a highlight right there in the center. And we'll add some highlights with my white gel pen later on too. For the white stripes, I just used some cold grays just to kind of give a little bit of dimension, but colored them the same way. Next, we'll go in with the greens, starting off with my lightest color, which is, oh boy, light phthalo green. I'll link it below because I'm not sure how to say that. Going in with my darkest color, which is deep cobalt green. Blending that out with the hooker's green, then the, that word again, green, and then back to my lightest color, just concentrating the shading on the left-hand side. For the signs, I'm going to be using the same color combination, except I'm going to bring in another mid-tone here just because it was such a large area. But I'm doing my shading, and here I'm going in with a light hand because I wasn't sure about having to add another color in. So I did go in with a light hand on this one just to kind of experiment with my colors a little bit. I started off with the same 4 colors I used for the gloves, and here I was left with way too big of a highlight. So this is where I decided to go ahead and bring in another color, and I'll go back over those same areas with a heavier hand, blending those out each time. And the color that I ended up bringing in was emerald green for the very lightest midtone, so the second to lightest color. And just blending that out and pressing down pretty hard, and finally blending that out with my lightest color here. And this is where Frankie decides to sit on my lap and hold down the cardstock for me as I was coloring. So I colored all 3 of the signs the same exact way. We'll skip through the rest of them. And finally, we'll go in to coloring, well, this little part of the sign. I just used 2 like golden yellow colors just to add a little bit of dimension there. And then for the snow that Santa is standing on, I'm going to go right in with my shadow colors, which is a cold gray 3 and a cold gray 2. Just putting a little bit of shading underneath each of those objects, including both of his feet, and then kind of extending that off to the left. And then finally, I will go in with my white pencil and cover up that entire area. I didn't really want to blend my shadows out too much that I created because I want them to still be visible and know that they're actually shadows. So once my coloring was complete, I'm going to go ahead and take one of the sentiments from the stamp set. Oh, here is, I'm sorry, I lie. I fixed up some of those lines that we colored over first. So for the sentiment, I'm going to go ahead and use my Misty just to make sure that I have this lined up correctly. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp this in the top and right in the middle of my card panel, just using that same blackout ink because it was on my desk. Figured I'm using the Misty, so if I don't get a great impression, I'll just stamp it twice. I originally put back my Misty and then had to bring it back out because I needed to stamp my little sentiment in my sign. So there's a couple of different combinations that you can use from this stamp set. So I just decided to this way to the North Pole. I figured that was cute enough. Lined those up in my little signs and then stamped that with my my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Thought maybe I'd have to stamp this twice being I was going over the colored pencil, but I ended up getting a good impression the first time. It did take a little bit more time to dry, so just keep that in mind. For the top, I'm going to treat my cardstock with my anti-static tool. I'm going to take a couple of the smaller snowflakes within the stamp set and just stamp a few of those on the top part of my card panel. This is the smallest and second to smallest snowflake within the stamp set. Then I'll just sprinkle on some white embossing powder and heat set that. Once I had my card put together, I realized that I had a big gap off to the right, so I did end up adding one of the teeny tiny snowflakes, just another one off to the right hand side, and kind of filled in that gap, but I did that off camera. So once that was heat set, I took my white gel pen and just added a little bit of a highlight to that little ball that's on top of the sign and on top of Santa's hat. Then I layered this onto a piece of black cardstock that was cut just slightly larger than the card panel, but just slightly smaller than my card base itself. And I'm just adhering this flat with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I did add some squiggles too to the sign, or to the little list that he's holding, to make it look as if that there's actually something written on it. Once I had that adhered to my black panel here, there is card bases that come in the kit that are also Audrey blue, which is why I picked this cardstock. And I'm going to adhere my entire card panel to that so that I have a little bit of a border on all four sides. But that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.